I want to start with landing the feature film.
That first experience was just so unbelievable. Weeks would pass, nothing would really happen, and then you get the calls like, we want you.
Justin Wu is a multi-award winning director, speaker, photographer, and creative director who's worked with world-class talent such as Simu Liu, Jeremy Irons, Selena Gomez,
and many more.
What was the most recent failure you've experienced that's really impacted you?
To not be as present as I want to be for my family.
You've let people down.
I feel like I've let people down, and there is one very big one, and that kind of ties to my father.
When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he wasn't given very long to live.
That was actually the best part of my life because every day became an opportunity. 9 days left. Here is what he wants to get off his chest. 8 days left. You'd pose more questions, and it would just inspire him to, again, start a whole different conversation. But by the end, we actually hit a wall. He told me very explicitly, this is as far as I would go. I'm not willing to share anymore, and this is what you have to live with.
If you could sit down for one more conversation with your dad and show him everything that you've done to this point, what would you hope his reaction would be? Justin, welcome back to Gents Talk.
Happy to be back.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I was looking at it, I think it was October of 2022 we did the last episode. So we're going on almost 2 full years now since we've last talked. I mean, we've talked in between, obviously, but I'm really excited to have this conversation. This doesn't happen if it wasn't for our friends at Angels Envy for helping us to put this together. So shout out to the team there for just being amazing partners on this. I was listening to our episode before coming into the studio because you had remarked how you enjoyed the last episode, but you really felt you wanted to get a little deeper into certain topics that matter to you. We talked about identity. We talked about your relationship with your dad. We talked about how film drives you, and you've got some exciting stuff we're going to be talking about in a moment, but I want to start with the identity piece. You talked about how it took you a while to really understand and comprehend the full scope of your own identity. How far along are you in that journey today? Where are you?
Still discovering myself. I feel that through the beauty of actually film and TV, I think a lot of the work that we do is about character analysis, right? We have a wide array of diverse characters that we have to always portray on screen, whether you're old or young, from different generations, different demographics. A lot of the work that we had to do is to do the proper research and understand what their backgrounds are, what their motivations are. And I find that when you're kind of deep diving into these different character archetypes, and watching characters and having them express it and really spending time with these characters on set, I really discover new aspects of myself, and I think that identity is also one of those things that's constantly evolving, right? And I define identity as, what values you aspire to have, what beliefs, what are your virtues, and I think these are sort of the elements that are constantly in flux, and being able to explore this with other human beings and have it expressed on camera, I think it's quite a beautiful thing. So I'd say that it's an ever-evolving journey, and I think that I'm much more sure of myself today than I've ever been. But it's still one of those things that I'm very excited to keep exploring as I'm going.
Is there anything from 2 years ago to where you are today? And I keep using 2 years ago for anyone who's listening and watching, just because that's when we last talked on the podcast. So from where you were 2 years ago when you stepped into the studio and where you are today, what's been the biggest change for you?
I think confidence.
It's a hard one.
It's a hard one because it's so much of this industry is I mean, I'm sure I mentioned this last time, and it's quite frequently brought up, this idea of this imposter syndrome and how I'm very young to this business, relatively speaking. I got in relatively quickly, and oftentimes when you're being put in a position of leadership where you have a lot of your staff younger than you, much of your staff older than you, you're put in a place where you have to very quickly be assertive and know exactly what you want, be very clear with your communication, and also just be able to express your own truth as clearly and as effectively as possible. So I think that I'm much more sure of myself, having been on so many different TV shows, and now arriving at this penultimate moment with my feature film.
Congrats on that, by the way. That's
Thank
huge.
you so much.
And we just teased it, but we're gonna come back to it. I promise. How do you be sure of yourself when you're talking to people who, in theory, have had more experience than you? That imposter syndrome just seems to be a theme that's constantly coming up in the conversations I've been having on the podcast, where no matter what position you are in life, no matter how senior or how junior you are in your role, in your function, imposter syndrome can creep in very quickly and can kill your confidence. So when you are on these sets, when you are in these meetings and you're having these conversations and you see the room, you see that there are people who've been around much longer, have been doing it much longer, have various skill sets. Some who, you might say they definitely do it better than me. Some will be at the same level, some you're junior. How are you navigating keeping the imposter syndrome at bay while also being present? Because I think that's part of the hard part is while all of this internal stuff is happening, you still have to focus on what's in front of you.
I attribute that to a technique that one of my mentors had reminded me and constantly reminds me, which is to know that you're worth it, right? They booked you for a reason. And I think that idea of you being selected for a very particular reason should tell you that you deserve this. So I think this idea of being worth it and deserving this title includes all the responsibilities that it has. And so when you can recognize that you've achieved something that other experts, studios, producers, decision makers have felt that you are the right person for the job, should give you the same level of confidence. So I think that kind of positive reinforcement of recognizing, they're putting millions of dollars on the line and believe that you can handle this is also a reminder for yourself. So I think that there's always a constant battle. I think, not jumping too far ahead, but this past weekend we had the festival screening of my feature, and there was an award show very similar to the TIFF Tribute Awards. There was an award show to celebrate, the top 10 upcoming actors by Variety, as well as these Lifetime Achievement Awards. And on stage, right next to me, you'd have people like Nicolas Cage and Diane Warren, and these people, they're just legends, right? And the fact that I'm in the same room with them, I think that is a clear visual representation where you feel the difference and where the imposter syndrome. These are people who've achieved something for an entire lifetime and are either on the rise or they've already made it on the big screen. And I think that that's where you'd feel it. But where I gain the most confidence is really when you're on set and the producers are hands off. They've given you the trust that you are now in charge. You're the captain of the ship, and they trust the direction you're taking it. So it's kind of a constant balance, I feel, and it does require a lot of reassurance and reminders. And I'm really thankful for friends and family who are able to kind of also remind me whenever I'm, racked with anxiety. It's like, no, you were chosen for a reason. So I feel that, but lately, over the past couple of years, I really feel that I'm much more sure of myself and know that, they chose me for a reason. So execute to the best of your abilities.
Yeah. So I like to ask people in the moments, a lot of what you described very reasonably stunts imposter syndrome's ability to take over. But a lot of it, the way you described it, is external. It's happening because you're at an event with so-and-so, and by looking at that external experience, you go, this is my validation. In the quiet moments when you're at home by yourself and you're working on something, or you're just reflecting on your life, and you start, your confidence starts to take a hit, the anxiety, like, oh, am I really as good as I think I am? Am I faking it the whole time?
Yeah.
What do you say to yourself? What techniques do you take? Some people journal, some people, just talk out loud. I know I've done that too. But what do you do to help yourself sort of continue to stay confident in those quiet moments?
this may sound very egotistical, but I find that it's the reminder of the journey that you've been on. So in my office, I have, the typical things like the college diploma on the wall, right? And that kind of tells you where you came from. But then, and also, I have a lot of these, mementos I've carried throughout my entire journey. So things like either a prop from a shoot that was very meaningful to me, that was a milestone moment for me personally, for either many different reasons. Either it was a personality that I'd really admired, that I never thought I would ever be able to work with, all the way to the placards I had, when I was directing Kim's Convenience, for instance, the chair backs. These are the I would say the plates that you'd have on the director's chair that has your clear name on it, as well as the TV show or the studio. And I think that when I was able to kind of see the growth that I've had and the many different steps that I've earned to kind of get to where I am, that gives me the full reminder that no, I am on the right path and I've earned it. It's not as if I jumped so far ahead and I skipped certain steps. I feel that when I see the level of progress that I've made, it's incremental, and at the same time it's well earned. So I think that that's one way in the quiet moments for me to see and understand, right, it may feel like, my God, it's only been 3, 4, 5 years that I just entered the business and now I'm here. But that said, I know that a lot of hard work has been put into it. So when I see those placards or chairbacks or those signatures from cast and crew, I vividly remember being there. I vividly remember all the challenges that I faced. I remember how I overcame them. Some challenges I could not face, and how with each successive project, I was able to strengthen those skills, as well as learn a lot about my own identity, my own leadership style, and be able to build upon that. And so I think that it comes with time, and it comes with the ability to reflect frequently on one's past achievements and failures, that I feel that in the quiet moments I'm able to be more sure of myself.
What was the most recent failure you've experienced that's really impacted you positively, negatively?
Interesting. Well, I would say that's a great question. That's a great question. There are a lot of like smaller failures. I'm trying to think if there was a big failure that I've had in my life.
And it may not have been, the failure itself may not have been big in terms of scale, but the impact it had on you was big.
Right. Then I would say there is one very big one, and that kind of ties to my father. And it not necessarily is too recent. In fact, it kind of ties back to our first conversation. And I would say failure to not be as present as I want to be for my family. I think that with the very fast-paced world that we live in, I try my best to be present for my family, but at the same time, I look back and I realize that there are some milestone moments that I wish I could have been part of. And that's just one of the hard realities of this business, is that when you're on a set, when you're on a TV show and the cameras are rolling, unexpected things can happen. The birth of a child, for instance, right? And not being able to take a day off and step away is pretty hard. And I think that there's a certain level of failure that comes with it, and a certain guilt. And I think that
I feel like you've let people down.
I feel like I've let people down, and it's a really weird balance that thankfully my friends and family are very supportive, and they understand the expectations that come with this job that I have. But nonetheless, I think that the biggest failure I have is to constantly try to make time to reflect, be present for my close ones that have supported me on my entire journey. So I'd say that the biggest learning I've had from that failure is rebalancing priorities, knowing really what really matters. I think that, oftentimes you could talk about, do what makes you happy. But although at the same time, I think another big part is do what makes you happy, but also do what makes sense and what's important to you, right? And sometimes it may not be happiness.
Yeah.
Right.
That's always the challenge, the fine balance between what you're doing and what you feel you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
That should version of ourselves that we're constantly playing tug of war with.
Exactly.
You touched on your dad. In our last conversation, you referenced how, speaking of being present, you talked about how when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he wasn't given very long to live. But to everyone's surprise, and thankfully, he had lived a lot longer than what the doctors had suggested would happen. And you talked about how it gave you an opportunity to finally be present with him. What was that journey really like? Just to knowing that every moment, like you don't know how many more of them you're going to get. That's a hard thing to, as I was listening to you talk about that again, I was reflecting on, if I had known X amount of time left with the people I love, like that's just even a hard thing to think about, let alone go through.
Yeah, it comes with a lot of mixed emotions, of course. I think the first, I would say, inkling is when you are faced with a harsh reality, right? So upon delivery of the news, you're in complete shock, and that shock really affects you emotionally. It really affects your judgment, perhaps. Of course, what the first thing I did was kind of rush back home, and just be present, do whatever my dad needs, get all the affairs settled. But then really becomes the true discovery. And I think what I'd done was to begin by listening. I think that's the first step, right? Listen to what his needs and wants are. So phase one would be, let's go through what he needs, so that I can then better, finally, hopefully, break through. And I think, as we mentioned in the first conversation, we never quite had the strongest relationship. We were quite distant. It was very perhaps transactional. We may have loved each other, but it's not as if he expressed his love to me in the way I would have loved. But I knew that there was so much more I could mine and dig through and to reforge the relationship I've always wanted with my father. And the first step is to kind of get, again, all the affairs settled so that all the remaining time that we have is to start the conversation, which is the hardest point, right?
Sure.
And that requires a lot of repetition. I remember so vividly sitting on the couch and, being a director, I'm trying to control everything. I was very insistent that we would start recording some of our conversations. And for posterity, I would explain to him like, would love for my future kids, if I have kids, to hear some of the stories and lessons from my father, their grandparents, and just capture the essence of who he is. And he was very resistant, of course. And of course, I turned the cameras off, I turned the mic off. And I think it just takes time, but also I think there's an element of urgency that's also quite bizarre, and it really transforms people. I remember from the time he was diagnosed, and you're given a period of time, say a few months. It's really hard to kind of like quantify months, right? Like when it's kind of vague. When you're given something more definite, like say, oh, you have a deadline in 10 days, you sort of know what a day feels like. The hours of sleep that you have, the hours that you're present in the day doing your morning routine or whatever, and like how much free time you have. But when you're given something as vague as months, 2 or 3 months, it's really hard to know what to do with that time. You can't really structure it, you can't really plan it. A lot of these things is about just being able to just pose the questions repeatedly. But the big turning point really was when the doctor said, oh, you have days left. And I think that's when things change, because with such a finite amount of time, even my dad was able to recognize, oh, wait, maybe there are things I want to get off my chest. Maybe there are apologies I want to give. Maybe there are questions he has of me that he had never posed before. So I think that level of urgency is what also kickstarts the conversation. But I think a lot of the legwork was building everything up to that. And there was a really beautiful concept that I unfortunately don't like, but accept. And it came up in the conversation that you had on stage about masculinity. It was this idea of vulnerability and reciprocity. And very early on, I known, again, as a director, that oftentimes to kind of get through to an actor who has to be vulnerable and share their deepest and darkest feelings, positive and negative, on camera in front of a crew of 150 people or so, the best technique was to open yourself up to them, which means sharing your personal insecurities, your personal journey and stories, hardship, because at the end of the day, on screen, you want real drama, right? And for actors to trust you, you have to open up to them first so that then they can share their personal stories to me. Because in a professional setting, I mean, I find that film and TV is so bizarre, and that, like, how can you, in any normal circumstance, so willingly divulge your personal deepest and darkest secrets
in front of our
for work? I mean, I can't even imagine, besides being a therapist, that there is any particular scenario that happens. But that's one of the requisites of being a director. So I learned that tool very quickly. So when that applies to my father, what I had done is open up, shared about my story coming out, some of the difficulties that I had coming out to my parents. For my story, it was actually quite accidental. My dad had discovered some way, and he challenged me on a car ride back from New Year's Eve when I expressed to my friend that I had a crush on a guy. And, you know, that trauma really stayed with me. And because of how distant they were and not quite open at the time, I left. I fled. I went to Paris, and I stayed there for almost a decade. And so when I was able to kind of express to him, you know, some of the challenges I had faced, how I overcame them, some challenges I could not overcome, and how I wished I had built up a dialogue with my father, so he could also give me some of his experiences. He was able to then understand. Right, Justin is divulging all this information. He's sharing his personal stories of what he wants, what he wishes, being vulnerable. And then that was the turning point, was then when he was able to say, okay, now that I've heard all this stuff, perhaps this is very common of many immigrants and of that culture not to really share so much, that once that happened, he was able to see the possibility of, like, oh, what if I were to express these things? Then the conversation took and really opened up. It still took some time and requires a lot of persistence, but he was able to say, when I was growing up, like, honestly, in my entire life, I would never even hear the phrase "when I was growing up," and it would never and start with a certain anecdote.
Yeah,
he'd talk about vague, pictures of what it was like, the hardships, but it was never specific. There was never one.
He
particular
never really
anecdote.
let you in.
He never really let me in. And I think that
Did you hold resentment to him for that?
Of course. The other challenge of being raised in Canada which is the beauty of it all, is that you have all these diverse voices and characters and personalities and individuals and people that are here. And very typical of Western culture is to be open and share, especially when it comes to as silly as things like show and tell in high school or in elementary school. And of course, your friends' parents would ask, native to Canada, like, oh, so what are your parents like? And so it was very, very difficult for me to answer. And there was a lot of guilt and shame to say, like, I really don't know. Yeah. I really don't know what my parents are like. I can tell you what they're like with me, but I don't know the history. I don't know the past. And as I've shared before, a lot of these immigrants have such deep trauma that they've tried to push through, and the way that they cope is to bury it, is to shield you from it, so that, and the aspiration is justifiable. They're trying to do it so that kids don't have to necessarily
feel what they felt,
or have to endure what they have to kind of deal with. So that I would say is one of the hardships I do regret, and I did have a lot of resentment against my parents. But after, again, I shared my vulnerability with the idea of reciprocity, and was very persistent and open, constantly sharing more stories of things I'd done, good and bad, in Paris or in Europe, and questions I had during that journey that I wished he was able to answer. And so retroactively, what I've done was also pose questions like, do you remember that year in 2016 when when this happened? My parents would only know the superficial details of like, I was in Berlin doing an exhibition, but they didn't know why I was doing it. They didn't know what I was inspired by. And then I would pose the question present with my father then. I was like, well, what are your thoughts about this? There was an exhibition I did about identity, about culture. And I just reversed the question like, oh, it would have been great if I had some consultation, heard some of your experience. How would you've experienced my exhibition? And again, just giving like a peek, giving an opening, a safe space for them to share. And that's when I really kind of started to kind of break through. And I think that was, I would say, the most meaningful use of my time with the remaining days. And to really go back to your first question of like, how did I use those days? I think that once you have that urgency, then it becomes more and more structured, because my dad's very cognizant that like, okay, 9 days left. So here is what he wants to get off his chest. 8 days left. You pose more questions and it would just inspire him to, again, start a whole different conversation. And then eventually it was a point where by near his last days, scheduled days. I mean, this is what the doctor said,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
I was able to then open up and finally record some of the stuff. And he was able to give me a monologue and just express his truth. And I would just pose questions, almost like a documentarian, but not just the best of his life, some of the worst parts of life, his own personal regrets. So I think that was great. And then what happens after? So as you said, my dad had even more time. And I actually turn it around and say that was actually the best part of my life, because every day became an opportunity. You're like, another day? I mean, okay. So then I was able to kind of review my notes and continue with my questions. It's like, okay, let's continue down this path. Much like how we're going deeper. It's like you have the opportunity to just go one step further, ask another question. Now, the end result was that, funny enough, is with all the bonus time we had, I really treat every day as a precious day with him, that by the end, we actually hit a wall. And it was actually beautiful in some way that he was like, and this is where the conversation ends. He told me very explicitly, this is as far as I would go. I'm not willing to share anymore. I've shared as much as I feel comfortable sharing, and this is what you have to live with. And I genuinely respected that. We all have our own secrets. We all have our own.
That just gave me goosebumps in some way. Like
the notion that, we all have limits.
Yeah.
But I was just so happy, genuinely happy, with no resentment, that I was able to kind of get to that point. That he shared his entire life story as much as he thought he could. And he told me respectfully what his limits were. And I don't know if there's any better way for me to know him, as such. And I really hope that people can take that opportunity. So I feel that the lesson to be gained here is that try not to let things that are so urgent, a life and death stakes, ticking time bomb of like a doctor telling you have 10 days left to start that process. And I think in retrospect, the one thing I would have done very early on is to be persistent and open up. I think there is this, again, back to this idea that like, well, if my dad doesn't open up, why would I open up? Right. But I just feel that, your parents should not be there to judge you. They should really be there to listen and support you. And I'm not saying this is the case for all parents, but, if you trust them to have your back or want the best for you, giving them some of your personal stories and sharing some of your vulnerabilities and stories would hopefully allow them to maybe start sharing with you before it's too late.
To us, envy is a good thing. It motivates us in the pursuit of better. Like crafting a bourbon, even the angels would envy. Angels envy, worth the envy.
Wow. What an incredible opportunity that you got at the end there to have that moment with your father. you talked about having to, on the idea of reciprocity, having to share and be first to share with the actors that you work with. Tell me more about like your career. You said only 4 to 5 years.
It's only
Like,
4 to 5
wild.
years.
I feel like it's been so much longer.
No, but that's, and like I had to remind myself, and that's where again right now as I'm sitting here talking to you, the imposter syndrome hits again, right? It's like a constant wave and that you have to just go through. Yeah, it's only been less than 5 years.
Wow. And you've worked now on a feature film. Tell me about that journey, because that I think is one really definitive way to stump imposter syndrome whenever it creeps up.
Yeah. It's the ultimate dream come true. I mean, just from what I remember so vividly when I was like, I think 8 years old or so, sneaking in, watching Jurassic Park with my cousins in the basement. Because obviously I was way too young to be able to watch a movie like that. I don't know. It just really piqued my interest. And I had this dream for the longest time that I want to be the person who did that. And, coming back to this project, so much of the process was unbelievable. It's a lot of firsts. I mean, it's a project of firsts, right? First time a studio calls you, first time a network calls you, first time a producer calls you and gives you a script. To give some context, when you're in TV, oftentimes they look at your body of work. They would hire you based upon your skill set. But I'd have no scripts to read. Here, it's a whole different process. The process begins with them giving you, first, of course, reviewing your body of work to see whether you are the right fit, approximately, vaguely. Then they would give you the private script for you to read. You'd read the script, you digest it, and then they would ask you, what's your take on it, right? So that was a first for me. It was a first where, because you had to then express how you interpret it. And this is something that never happens in film and in TV specifically, because in TV you have something called a showrunner. A showrunner is the visionary behind the show, and it's oftentimes that they dictate to you what their vision is, and then yes, there is an opportunity for you to go back to them, and you are an artist, you're a respected artist, and you still have to give them how you interpret it, but it's still very much someone else's vision. In this particular case, you are the visionary. They've given you the script is just a blueprint, but you have to take it upon yourself to imbue your own personality, your own identity into the piece, and whether you connect with it or you don't connect with it, where you can add, where you feel can be enhanced or taken back. And so I think that first experience was just so unbelievable. I remember I even teared up actually after I made the pitch. So in the process, you take the script and they ask you to give us a pitch. Tell us how you see the scene. How do you paint the scene? What are the characters like? Who do you envision being part of it, right?
So there's no actors at that point identified?
No actors. It's just purely a thought, right? Here is just a blank slate. And a blueprint of the script is that there are no actors where they tie to it. Now, arguably this particular one, the lead actor is also one of the executive producers. His name is Beck.
Oh, I didn't know he was the producer.
Yeah, he was one of the EPs who actually helped originate the story. Okay. And so he was very part of the very first conversation. So I knew he was part of it. But there are so many characters in the story.
Sure.
I mean, you also have the lead, the girl who is the protagonist. And we hadn't cast her at that point, right? It was the first step to kind of get a director, so that the director can also take charge with the studio to kind of figure out and find all the other pieces.
Yeah.
And it was just truly unbelievable that I was just talking to these studio executives and sharing my thoughts of like how it's done and how I would do it. And that was the first step, right? And I was like, weeks would pass, nothing would really happen, and then you get the call. It's like, we want you. That's step one. We want to attach you to the project. I'm like, okay, well, that sure, right? Yeah. I mean, and I'm always very cognizant of this idea of Hollywood talk, this this idea that it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all like through back
Until
channeling
you're on set.
until you're on set. I was
Yeah.
like, sure, whatever, right? Even signing a piece of paper showing your intent doesn't really mean much, I feel.
Yeah.
And I have been on commercials where you get booked for the job, you're supposed to fly to Tokyo, and then one day, 24 hours prior, they cancel the entire thing. So I've been through enough rejection that I know so consciously what it feels like to have the rug pulled underneath you.
So you
many
reserve
times.
yourself a little bit
I
as a
reserve
result.
myself.
Yeah. Fairly, yeah.
I create this kind of shield.
Yeah.
I make sure that I don't get too invested in something
Yeah.
before I get disappointed, right? But that was the first step. Then you go into casting. Then you get the cast. You meet with the cast.
And can we just list out the cast just for people to understand the magnitude of this film?
Sure, and even that alone is also kind of a story. So we have our wonderful lead, Noah Beck, who's the romantic interest.
Mm-hmm.
The lead of the film, her name is Sienna Agudong, who I fought for. She's an incredible young actor, who was the lead of Resident Evil, a TV show on Netflix, and just seeing her, watching her on camera, she just sings like. She has so much to express. Other characters, other actors that I never thought I would ever be able to work with, especially on my first feature, include the likes of James Van Der Beek,
Dawson's Creek,
Varsity Blues,
yeah,
Deborah Cox, the legendary Canadian Deborah Cox, singer, and other friends who I've made throughout my career and who I also admire, like Drew Ray Tanner from Riverdale, and so much more. You know, these are just like the characters. These are the actors that we had, and I really felt like, no, I can't believe this is actually happening on my first feature. This is unbelievable, right? But oftentimes, again, back to the whole same technique, I would just look at the wall, look at my placards, and remind myself I've earned this to ground me. I even have a photo of it so that anytime I feel this imposter syndrome, I would just pull it up and I earned this. I took all the different steps. I didn't jump in. I didn't cheat the system. I did the work, right? And then now that the actors were there and to go through the table read, that was even that alone. I remember I completely blanked out. I just couldn't believe. I had to take a moment to just absorb what was happening in front of me. Now, the table read had to be on Zoom because the actors were all across the country, internationally. And just to see their faces, read the words, and having them interact, and me being in the corner.
You're like a kid in a candy store.
Yeah, I was a kid in a candy store. I'm like, I really can't believe this. I really felt like it was I was pinching myself. I was actually underneath the table. Just grabbing and pinching myself, like, is this really happening? But we passed that phase, and then comes the real fun part where you meet the actors in person, and kind of tie it all together. The first thing you do is, of course, you do the whole introduction and whatnot, and they interview you the same way I had to interview them right during the casting process. Is what tied you to the project, and that's where I think real connections are made. Real trust is made, real bonding is made, because that question is very kind of a quite loaded question.
Sure.
It's like what brought you to the project, and often it really is personal trauma that you have to share with them. It's like, oh, there's a scene in the film or the character arc is very similar to mine, and this is not confidential. The story is really about this girl, aspiring dancer, who wants to follow in her late mother's footsteps to become a star dancer, following her late mother's alma mater. And that journey is so similar to mine. And that's a very obvious one, chase after your dreams, which is a very big theme of the film. But within that is also, different aspects of the film touches on a bit of grief, a bit of acceptance, and of course, romance. The romance part is something we can all relate to.
Sure.
We all know the feeling is like to fall in love for the very first time, which is great.
That excitement, the nervousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All the sparks.
Yeah.
But that's the obvious one, and that's the kind of through line of it all. But what I have also discovered, which is so beautiful, especially with the newer films, is that romance happens when people are vulnerable with each other, right? You have the very superficial first date. The first date's about, do we have a spark? Do we have a connection? And often the spark really happens when someone shows you a side of them that's unexpected. That's like, first,
I feel like you just showed me a private version of you just for me. Yeah.
Precisely, right? You've given me a peek. Like, you can, in today's world, you got Tinder, you got the profile picture, you got some of the vague interests, but to have the conversation and realize, wow, like they have this whole other side of them that profile photo and some descriptors just didn't express, and that's when you really get charmed by them, right?
Yeah.
So that's the easy part. But I think much of the conversation when it comes to these prolific actors is to know, are you able to understand and lead the whole journey, and especially the tougher parts, because the tougher scenes that you're going to have to face, and this is something that we always discuss when it comes to planning a film, is that where do we put in the schedule the most challenging scenes?
Yeah.
The scenes where you have to deal with loss, the scenes where you have to break up, or the emotional scenes that take a lot out of the actor, right? And so they challenge you as much as you challenge them about, well, do you as a director, Justin, actually understand this, and why do you understand it? So very early on, almost like therapy, you're just divulging your own personal insecurities and your own anecdotes of, like, I've dealt with losing someone like my father. I've dealt with failing at, in photography. I remember having my portfolio thrown in the trash and saying my work is complete garbage and I have no future in the business. I remember all those different aspects, and to express it to them and then reverse it and ask of them too. Even though they're prolific actors, I need to also make sure as a director that I know what they're drawing from privately before expressing it to the rest of cast and crew. It's like, so where was your interest in this? I don't know. I think those early conversations, especially with people like Deborah Cox, who I just met in Toronto no less than 2 years ago at the Junos. So after the Junos, she performed on stage. I, of course, know her. We know her as this legendary personality and talent, this icon of Canada. The spark it just hit me somehow in mid-performance that I know her life story from what I read, but I was so curious to see, could she play this role? So after the Junos happened, I just found my way through a friend of mine at Sony to meet her, discuss, get her contact, then have lunch with her. And then that I think was the very first step when I realized that I'm now in this position to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah, you're taking the reins at this point and making it happen.
Yeah.
So what was the total time spent making this film?
I would say the genesis was about 2 years ago.
Okay.
2 years ago, there was a script that was laid upon me and I was attached to the project. And that process took, as I mentioned, takes some time. But once you're attached to the project, then they have to find the financing.
And then they go through the whole
rigmarole, and there was the financial crisis. Then the strike happened,
Right.
So the film was supposed to be ready to film 1.5 years ago, but through various iterations and deal making, we finally landed. And so I'd say it took 2 years to kind of get the project financed, but then the actual project only a few months.
Wow.
And it's fast. It's really fast.
It happens quick.
Happens really fast. I think that to give some context, around February-ish, we're given the green light. And then by April, you're flown in to the location. And for us, it was Victoria, BC, to begin location scouting. And very rapidly, you're like, you got a certain number of weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks. Now you have to hire everyone. You have to build out the crew, find the locations, and then the team starts assembling.
Yeah.
Rehearsals begin. Final casting for all the supporting characters come in, and then you're on set for what feels like a minute, but
When did you wrap up?
We wrapped, I believe, so hazy now, like July. I mean,
and film premieres
Film premieres this fall.
this fall.
This
Okay.
fall. I can't give the dates yet.
No, that's good. That's fine.
Premieres this fall.
I gotta ask you, like, this incredible journey of yours from where you started hearing you say, for example, like your photography stuff got tossed in the garbage. I'm like, I can't believe there are jerks out there like that. But this incredible, inspiring journey from where you started to finally landing the feature film, working on it, you know, knocking imposter syndrome out the door and keeping it at bay. I got to ask you one more question here. If you could sit down for one more conversation with your dad and show him everything that you've done to this point, what would you hope his reaction would be?
Well, the obvious one would be pride. I think that that's, I would say I wouldn't call this a failure, because I really feel that it's a false expectation that anyone can achieve the dream and present it to the parents in their lifetime. I think that's always the aspiration. I would say that I've made it. You know, I think the hardest part that really always hits me really hard is the fact that my father had felt and seen me go on this perilous journey with seemingly no hope, all these rejections. And it's not as if all this time it was a smooth path to kind of get here. I may have broken into film and TV 5 years ago, and now I'm making a movie. But people often forget that it's taken more than a decade for me to break into the industry. Mm-hmm. And my dad was very observant. He saw it all. He saw me live in this really crummy apartment in Paris, living with 2 or 3 roommates while I was in LA, and just struggle living on couches. And he never saw me succeed. And I think that probably would be the thing I would love to do for him, is to be able to tell him I'm all right and I've made it. And I think that would open a whole other conversation, I feel, you know.
Absolutely.
A lot of what he shared was a lot of the difficulties he's had and some of his success. But, you know, I would have loved to have that father-son bonding moment for us to feel like, you know, we're on the right path. And I really would have felt that, and I genuinely would believe that would have opened up a whole different life that we would have had together.
That's amazing.
And
and
funny enough, actually, just one short anecdote is that one beat exists in my film vaguely. I won't talk specifics, but, like, you know, I just had the best relationship working with James Van Der Beek as a father, and he became this kind of like surrogate father for me on moments, because, you know, before we talked about one particular scene, we just spent time together discussing in detail how we're planning to express it, and then I'll tell you this. There was one scene that we had, and while it was performing, I could see my father, and I broke down in tears. The assistant director broke down in tears. So did the producer. And at the end, I was choking so much I couldn't even call cut. My assistant director had to call cut for me, and I just went up to James and I gave him a hug, and he was asking, "Justin, are you okay?" And I said, "I'm fine, but thank you for being there and for expressing that particular truth, a moment that I never had, but I felt that could have been what it could have been like." And yeah,
that's beautiful.
And that scene still, and it will always be one of my cherished memories on the set.
I can't wait to watch it. Justin, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this journey, the lessons. It's all incredible. Congratulations on the film. Congratulations on all that you're doing. It's so exciting. I can't wait to celebrate the film for you, with you, and in support of you and everything. Thank you so much for coming through. Thank you, of course, to our friends at Angels Envy for making this episode happen. Can't do it without them. And thank you to everyone for watching and listening. We appreciate you. But Justin, one final thing, just thank you.
No, thank you so much. And the film comes out this fall on Tubi.
Okay, there you go. Make sure you tune in, everybody. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Gents Talk podcast. I'm your host, Samir Mourani, and as you know, we just sat down with Justin Wu, an incredible award-winning director, photographer, and creative. I'd like to take a moment to recap what we discussed in a quick episode reflection brought to you by our friends here at Angel's Envy, Canada's #1 super premium bourbon. It was an incredible conversation with Justin, talking about identity, relationship with his father, and that one in particular struck me quite profoundly. It's always an interesting subject when you hear men talk about the relationships they have with their father, and in Justin's case, talking about how he knew he had such a finite amount of time before, that relationship would no longer exist. And the steps that he took to try and make amends and to build a real meaningful relationship with his father was incredible to see. And I think it's a nice reminder for all of the gents out there, and for anyone in general, really. Make an attempt to build that relationship with your loved ones, because you really don't know how long you have with each of them. And now, if I can ask you one favor. No matter where you're watching this, listening to this, please follow, subscribe, rate the episode. Your support means the world to us. None of what we do can happen if it's not for these interactions that you do. So thank you for all that you do to support this amazing podcast. It allows us to bring in incredible guests every week. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you to our friends again at Angel's Envy for helping us to put this episode together. Cheers.